In this video, we're going to talk about Confucianism. And what's different about Confucianism than the other ethical theories that we've studied this semester is that Confucianism doesn't come from the Western tradition of philosophy at all. By West, I mean European and Anglo-American traditions of philosophy. Instead, Confucianism originates in China. Now, Confucius is the head of the Confucian tradition, as you might have expected. And in Chinese, his name is more like Kungzi, or you might see it as Kung Futsa, or all that means is Master Kung. And I'll refer to him as Confucius. That's the Latinized version of his name. Confucius lived from 551 to 479 BCE, and he's really one of the most influential humans of all time. He occupies a place in Chinese culture and really Eastern culture generally that's comparable to someone like Jesus and Western culture. So he lived just before what's called the Warring States period in Chinese history. It's also called the period of 100 schools of philosophy. And this is a period of a lot of political turmoil. At the same time, it was also a period of intellectual ferment in China. Now, Confucius was trying to retrieve and implement the values, as he saw them, of the Zhou culture, which was in its glory days, traditionally dated at 1122 to 256 BCE. So he spent a lot of time researching the values of Zhou culture and trying to implement those. He spent his life unsuccessfully looking for permanent employment as a court minister to a ruler whom he could advise. So China was, what's now China, was divided up into a lot of different regional territories with their own warlords, and each had their own court. And so he was trying to find employment as an advisor in one of those, and was not successful by his own lights. Now, Confucius himself did not write anything down. And this is kind of another parallel of Jesus, you might say, or Socrates as well, who none of them wrote anything down, but their disciples collected their teachings after them. So we are reading a selection from the book called the Analects by Confucius, and that's a collection of sayings by and about Confucius recorded by his later disciples. And that the philosophy of Confucianism became dominant not during Confucius's own lifetime, but later during the Han Dynasty from 202 BCE to 220 BCE. And even after that, has retained a position of massive significance in Chinese and Eastern thought. The Analects is a book that was read very closely and very carefully, usually memorized by virtually every educated Chinese person for 2,000 years. And it served as the basis for the Chinese civil service exam right up until the beginning of the 20th century. So this is just a massively influential text for one of the largest countries and cultures on the globe. Now, Confucius was not the last member of the Confucian tradition. He's not the final word. He's had centuries of commentators. One of the most important was Mensa, or Munsa. I'm not good at my Chinese pronunciation, but he's referred to in the West as Mencius. And he lived some generations after Confucius, near the beginning of the Warring States period. So we are reading a brief selection from Munsa as well, from Mencius. Now, like I said, the Confucian tradition persisted, and in the 20th century, especially with exposure to Western streams of thought, the Confucian tradition suffered a lot of conflict with and challenge from Western science, democracy, modernity, and then from communism. All of those were forces that really ran against the grain of Confucianism in a lot of different ways. And so it had some tough times in China. However, recent decades have seen a resurgence of various eclectic kinds of Confucianism, uh, appropriations and applications of Confucianism, not just in China, but much more broadly around the globe as well. Okay, so as we turn to the Analects and to Mencius, I think that based on the kind of philosophical theories that we've been studying so far, we might be surprised and even perplexed about this text and about what to do with it as philosophers. Because what you have is a series of sayings and stories, not a systematically outlined philosophy or system. It's almost like you're dipping into a kind of wisdom literature, sort of like the book of Proverbs, if you've read the Hebrew and Christian scriptures. It's aphorisms in many ways. So you might even ask, is it a philosophical text at all? There don't seem to be arguments in there. However, as you study the book, you see that there is an interlocking set of ideas about morality, about society, about politics, even about the good life. So even though it may be debatable whether Confucius is doing philosophy in the way that Westerners might expect, it does seem pretty clear that Confucius has a philosophy, a system of ideas. Now, you might be wondering, is the Analects actually a religious text? And the answer is, well, I mean, it depends how you want to define religion. It's true that there are references to what we translate as heaven, to the spirits of the dead, to ritual sacrifices and other ceremonies that we might think of as religious. So in that sense, is it religious? Yeah, sure. However, there are no claims to divine revelation. Confucius does not claim to be a prophet. It's not even clear whether he believes in a personal creator deity at all, or whether he just, when he refers to heaven or Tian, he just has in mind some sort of very vague fate or cosmic order or something like that. So it's not religious. It depends how you define religion. And I'm not sure that we actually need to settle that for our purposes in order to appreciate its ideas. So if there aren't arguments in here, then why are we supposed to believe anything that Confucius says? And I don't have a final answer to that. Here are just some possibilities that came to mind for me. You might say, if you're a Confucian, look, this stuff just rings true. It has intuitive force and plausibility. And philosophers in the West also rely on that kind of evidence sometimes. You might say, well, we can test Confucius's ideas for their internal coherence. It all fits together. It all interlocks in a harmonious and pleasing way. And, Western philosophers also appeal to considerations like that. You might say, well, look, these ideas have come from somebody, namely Confucius, who lived a really great life by following these ideas. Everybody who, all of his followers anyway, think this guy was awesome. It really worked well for him. So, that counts in the favor of these ideas. And you might just say, look, regardless of whoever Confucius was or how his life turned out, we can test these ideas against our own lived experience of the world. We can see if they work. And arguably, you might say they do. So I think those are all possible arguments that one might make in support of Confucianism. I'm not necessarily making them, but I think that's one way you could approach these. Okay, so let's turn to the actual, before we turn to the actual content of the text, let me explain to you some frequent references which you're going to see in the text. So the Analects is a difficult, challenging text for modern Western people because so much of where it's coming from, the world it's speaking to and from, is foreign to us. So these might be some helpful starting points. You might see references in the Analects to what's called the Shujing, also translated as the book of history or the book of documents. And Confucius is a scholar of the documents and the history that was available to him, and he appeals to these as sources of examples. You'll see references to Yao, Shun, and Yu. These are legendary kings, legendary sage kings from kind of a mystical antiquity. So for Confucius and Confucianism, they are ideal role models, but not necessarily historical, although they might have regarded them that way. And in the same way, you'll see references to the founders, the alleged founders of the Zhou dynasty. King Wen is the father, King Wu is his son. The Duke of Zhou is Wu's younger brother. And the Duke of Zhou is really is a special figure for Confucius as a role model. The Shijing is the book of poetry. It's also translated as the odes or the songs, and this gets quoted a lot in the Analects and other Confucian texts. And then you'll also see references all along the way to Yan Hui, Zilu, Zigong, and all these other disciples of Confucius, who you'll see him interacting with them. You'll see them passing on his teaching. These guys get referenced throughout the Analects. It's not, for our purposes, it's not too important that you know who they are, just as you get the basic idea. They're his disciples. All right, now let's start getting into the actual meat of Confucian ideas. First of all, some key terms which will help to orient us. You'll see this idea of the junzi. I'm sure I'm not saying that right, the junzi, but this gets translated a lot of different ways, but the kind of the core meaning that you can think of is the gentleman. Our translation renders it as the exemplary person. One commentator says it's a person who has achieved the Confucian virtues, which, as we'll see, include virtues like humaneness and wisdom. So this is kind of the ideal person that one wants to be. There's actually a number of different kind of ideal persons that the Confucian might want to be. The highest of those is actually the sage. It's not clear whether anybody could be a sage, but the junzi, that seems within reach for a lot of us. And again, that's someone who exemplifies all these virtues. You'll see references to the Tao. Well, it gets translated as the way. Now, you might be familiar with that term. You might have heard of Taoism. And the word Tao appears not just in Taoism, but it's a broad idea, which means the way, in a way that Westerners might be familiar with as well, as the path to go on, the right path. So the right way of life. You'll see a lot of references to learning or education. And what's in view here? What kind of learning does Confucius or Confucianism have in mind? Well, he means learning the rights from ancient documents. Now, that the word rights is R-I-T-E, not R-I-G-H-T. So I'm not talking about the Bill of Rights, like what people owe me or something like that. Rights are rituals. And Confucius puts a lot of weight on rituals and doing rituals in the right way. We'll say more about that in a second. So, but to be a learned person means to study the ancient documents, to know the right way to do the rituals, as well as learning poetry from the book of the Odes, which I mentioned before. Confucianism also puts high priority on the 6 arts, and these include ritual propriety, or li, which I'll say more about in a second, performing music, archery, charioteering, writing, like calligraphy, and calculation. Now, these arts aren't just sort of hobbies. They cultivate and they express moral character, according to Confucianism. So you'll see references to these throughout the Analects as well. Now, we've talked about the junzi, which is the person who exemplifies the virtues, and we've talked about these arts, which help us to cultivate and express the moral virtues. But what are the key virtues for Confucius and Confucianism? Well, we'll look at those in a second, but the important thing to note here is that Confucianism is focused upon the cultivation of virtue. And we can compare Aristotle here. There are fruitful comparisons. What are these virtues? What are the character traits, the dispositions that Confucius values? Well, these are dispositions to act appropriately in our various relationships. And relationship is the other central idea of Confucianism. You could understand, I think, most of Confucianism if you get the idea of the virtues that constitute character, and you get the idea of the relationships in which character is expressed. And the key relationships are to our parents, to our children, to our spouse, to our rulers. If you're a ruler, your relationship to your subjects, relationships between friends, and even our relationships to humanity at large. And when these relationships are right, when we are doing right in all of our relationships, then that's how we achieve harmony and flourishing of the whole society, of the whole world. That's the goal, the telos for Confucianism. It is oriented towards social welfare through the flourishing of our individual relationships. So you can see this expressed in a few lines from Mensa. He says, the root of the world lies in the state. The root of the state lies in the family. And the root of the family lies in oneself. In other words, if you get your own character right, your family's going to do well. If all the families are doing well, the state's going to be doing well. And if the government's doing well, the world's going to be doing well. That captures really the big worldview idea of Confucianism. Or that next line here. If everyone would treat their parents as parents and their elders as elders, the world would be at peace. So this is really another way of thinking of this modern line that says the personal is political. That's kind of true for Confucianism, maybe not in the way that contemporary people who quote that mean, but if our personal relationships get right, that's the way to world peace, literally. There's 5 key relationships in Confucianism that are central. First, and the most important by far, is the relationship between fathers and sons. And it's the duty of the son to show filial piety to his father. We'll say more about that in a second. Filial piety, honor, respect, obedience, a kind of reverence towards his father. And the father, on the other hand, is also obligated to set a good example to the son. The minister, by a minister we mean somebody who works for a ruler. The minister is to show obedience and loyalty to the ruler, and the ruler is supposed to rule over the minister and the whole country with justice and righteousness and benevolence. Wife and husband, the wife is supposed to be obedient to the husband, and the husband is supposed to faithfully lead, be faithful to the wife and to lead. Relationships between the young and the old, between elders and the youth. It's supposed to be one of respect from the youth to the elders, and then the elders are supposed to set a good example for the youth. And between friends, there's supposed to be a mutuality and a trust, and I would say a loyalty between them. These are the 5 key relationships. Now, even just seeing this emphasis on these kinds of special relationships, you can already see some ways that Confucianism is different than other ethical theories that we may have considered. For one thing, Confucianism is completely opposed to egoism. We learned about egoism when we talked about Thomas Hobbes. Egoism is the view that I ought to look out for number one. That's my primary goal ethically. Confucianism says, no way, don't look out for number one. You need to do your duty to other people. It's all about looking outward to others. And then Confucianism is also opposed to impartiality. Now, we looked at impartiality when we studied utilitarianism. And the utilitarian wants to say, look, everybody's welfare counts equally. I can't privilege somebody's welfare more than somebody else's. I got to work equally for the good of all. They all count. And Confucianism says, no way. You have totally different duties towards your father than you do towards somebody who's not your father, towards your friend, or towards a stranger. You have totally different duties towards your ruler than your wife. So it's your relationships which determine the very unique and different duties that you have towards different people. In fact, the ideas of egoism and of utilitarianism were already ones that were being debated in China in Confucius's time, and Confucius, as well as Munsa and his the disciples, they already opposed them. So we find this passage in Munsa. It says, "Yang Zhu is for oneself, egoism. This is not to have a ruler. If you're looking out for number one, then you're not going to obey your ruler. Moza is impartial caring. That's kind of your utilitarian philosophy. This is not to have a father, because if you treat everybody the same impartially, then you're not treating your father as if he was different and special. It's like you don't have a father. To not have a father and to not have a ruler is to be an animal." So again, the Confucianism sees these special relationships and the duties that they produce as essential to our identity as humans. You lose those and you're an animal. Now, the key virtues that are to be expressed in these relationships are as follows. The most important is ren, which is most simply translated as benevolence. You will see it translated in our translation as authoritative conduct. But you can think benevolence, being good to people, being humane, showing compassion or sympathy for others. That's the idea of ren. Yi, again, this gets a lot of different translations, but you can think righteousness or justice. That's doing what's fitting or appropriate, even being moral or morality in general. It's, Van Norden says, it's the integrity of a person who disdains to demean himself by doing what is shameful and base, even if doing so would reap benefits. So doing what is right, giving people their due at all costs. G, that is, you can think of it most simply as wisdom. It's to realize or to know, as our translation puts it, being a good judge of the character of others, having skill at means and reasoning, that is, knowing how to achieve some goal, being able to figure out the steps you need to take to get there, and understanding of and commitment to the other virtues, prudence. Those are all getting at the ideas associated with G. And then we have Li. And Li is one of the, I think, the most difficult for us to get our heads around. I mean, we're familiar with benevolence, we're familiar with justice, we're familiar with wisdom, but this idea of ritual propriety is probably foreign to many of us Westerners. But it's very important for Confucianism. It is the virtue that consists in performing the rites with the proper motivations and in the right way. So what kind of rites or rituals are in view here? Well, there are customs, ceremonies, and traditions of proper behavior. They cover all aspects of ancient Chinese life. They included the clothes you wear to the right meeting, playing the right music after the right meal, the right way of having a funeral, the right way of performing sacrifices to one's ancestors and to other deities. And these are very important in Confucianism. So it's like ceremonial correctness. You could think of it like etiquette, but etiquette on steroids. So that's Li, ritual propriety. And then finally, and this is extremely important, we'll talk about this quite a bit more, Zhao. This is translated as filial piety or responsibility, honoring one's parents, which is a very high priority. Now, if you embody all these virtues, as I said before, you attain the status of a junzi, a gentleman, an exemplary person. And in our excerpt, here's what we see about the junzi. Unlike a petty person who thinks of his own interests and comfort, the exemplary person thinks only of benevolence, that is, doing good to others, and of righteousness, justice, giving to all their due. He values personal character and integrity rather than social recognition. And we see that in the very first of the Analects, where Confucius says, hey, don't worry too much about whether you get acknowledged. He says, to go unacknowledged by others without harboring frustration, is this not the mark of an exemplary person, a junzi? And this is Confucius's own life story, right? Because he never got the job he thought he deserved. He says, don't worry about it. The master said, don't worry over not having an official position. Worry about what it takes to have one. Do not worry that no one acknowledges you. Seek to do what will earn you acknowledgement. That is, worry about the quality of person that you are, not about whether it gets recognized. The exemplary person practices self-denial. He's careful with his words. He's serious in his deeds. And he loves to learn from other exemplary persons. There is a deep strand of the value of humility, which runs through Confucianism. So that's the gentleman. Now I want to turn now to this virtue of filial piety. This is just of preeminent importance in Confucianism. It's described in our reading as the root of character. Exemplary persons, says Confucius, concentrate their efforts on the root. For the root having taken hold, the way, the Tao, the right lifestyle will grow therefrom. As for filial and fraternal responsibility, it is, I suspect, the root of authoritative conduct. In other words, the root of becoming a benevolent person is to be filial and fraternal, to honor one's parents and one's brothers, one's elder brother in particular. That's the core. That includes, filial piety includes obligations towards our parents during their lives, obedience, respect, service with the utmost strength. And that doesn't end when you leave the house. In fact, the good Confucian doesn't necessarily leave his parents' household at adulthood. This runs throughout adulthood. It also includes obligations after your parents die. You need to give them the right funeral rituals. You need to offer perpetual sacrifices to them. You need to maintain your father's ways for years after he's gone. And the idea is that this is essentially connected to, it's really the root of respectful submission to all rulers and to our elders in general. Now, one really, I think, interesting and touchy part of Confucianism is how far does this go, this filial piety? Confucius is willing to take it perhaps farther than some of us might be comfortable with. So there's a very famous passage, it's short, in the Analects, which says this: the governor of Shi, in conversation with Confucius, said, in our village, there is someone called True Person. When his father took a sheep on the sly, he reported him to the authorities, turned in his own father. And the governor of Shi thinks that's integrity. Well, Confucius replied, those who are true in my village conduct themselves differently. A father covers for his son, and a son covers for his father. And being true lies in this. So filial piety includes covering for your father when he steals from other people, and also fathers for sons the same way. Wow, what do you think of that? We could ask questions about that, but in Munza, he gives other examples of this kind of piety. Again, even towards an abusive father. So the legend about Shun, a mythical sage king, is this: Shun is supposed to be an ideal model of filial piety. His parents are cruel and try to kill him, but Shun remained very affectionate and obedient towards them, and he could never be happy until they were reconciled. What do you think of that? Do you owe duties of filial piety, even this kind of heartfelt love, towards abusive, seriously abusive parents? The same goes for your duties towards your older brother. Shun, the mythical sage king, had an older half brother, Zhang, who wanted to kill him. Shun knew that Zhang wanted to kill him. But when Zhang came to see him, Shun offered him a position of authority. Actually, so Shun had been made, I think, emperor by this point. And it says when Zhang was concerned, Shun was concerned too. And when Zhang was delighted, Shun was delighted too. He maintains this deep love, affection, and even gives privileges to his murderous older brother out of fraternal piety. What do you think of that? So as we think about Confucianism and this kind of worldview, let's compare it some with other normative theories that we've studied. So if you compare it with divine command theory, Confucian ethics is very different. Confucian ethics is grounded ultimately in human relationships with each other, not really in a divine commander. Like I said before, it's not even clear that he believes in a personal God, and a personal God doesn't play any role in kind of determining your duties, from what we can tell from the Analects. Now, what about natural law theory that grounds ethics in human nature? Well, that's less clear to me. Confucianism may or may not be grounded in a theory of human nature. You might want to, study more and see if that is really what's driving Confucius here. It's not totally clear. It is clear, as I said before, that Confucianism rejects egoism, and that was the basis of Hobbes' social contract theory. It's totally against that. You can't just look out for number one. You got duties to others. And it also rejects the impartiality requirements that characterize utilitarianism and actually Kantianism too. There are other differences with Kantianism. Confucianism is not focused on the will or on intentions or on personal autonomy, definitely not autonomy, or even on reason quite in the same way as Kantianism is. It is concerned with intentions. That does matter, but not in the kind of exclusive and ultimate way that it matters for Kant. And then Confucianism is clearly hierarchical and it's patriarchal. That is, it's focused on authority, and that authority is male all the way up, as you can see. And that seems like it runs pretty contradictory to feminist ethics. On the other hand, it seems pretty similar, in many ways at least, to Aristotelian virtue ethics, and very friendly towards the kind of pluralistic duties that W.D. Ross talks about. Hey, you got different duties, largely depending on your different relationships with people. That could fit pretty coherently, I think, with Ross. So I think there's a lot of questions we can ask here about all these features of Confucianism. I will leave it to you to study it more and to ponder it more.